Calgash is an alien world, and it is not our intention to have you think that it is identical to Earth. Even though we depict its people as speaking a language that you can understand, and using terms that are familiar to you, those words should be understood as mere equivalents of alien terms. That is, a conventional set of equivalents of the same sort that a writer of novels uses when he has foreign characters speaking with each other in their own language, but nevertheless transcribes their words in the language of the reader. So when the people of Calgash speak of miles, or hands, or cars, or computers, they mean their own units of distance, their own grasping organs, their own ground transportation devices, their own information processing machines, etc. The computers used on Calgash are not necessarily compatible with the ones used in New York, or London, or Stockholm. And the mile that we use in this book is not necessarily the American unit of 5,280 feet. But it seems simpler and more desirable to use these familiar terms in describing events on this wholly alien world than it would have been to invent a long series of wholly Calgashian terms. In other words, we could have told you that one of our characters paused to strap on his quanglishes before setting out on a walk of 7 walks among the main glebish of his native snoob, and everything might have seemed ever so much more thoroughly alien. But it would have also have been ever so much more difficult to make sense out of what we were saying, and that did not seem useful. The essence of this story doesn't lie in the quantity of bizarre terms we might have invented. It lies rather in the reaction of a group of people somewhat like ourselves, living on a world that is somewhat like ours in all but one highly significant detail, as they react to a challenging situation that is completely different from anything the people of Earth have ever had to deal with. Under the circumstances, it seemed to us better to tell you that someone put on his hiking boots before setting out on a 7-mile walk than to clutter the book with quanglishes, vorks, or glebishes. If you prefer, you can imagine that the text reads vorks wherever it says miles, glizbis wherever it says hours, and sleshtraps where it says eyes. Or you can make up your own terms. Vorks or miles, it will make no difference when the stars come out. What I want to talk about in this video is the practice in many pieces of mostly genre fiction, such as sci-fi, fantasy or post-apocalyptic media, to obfuscate labels and terms for gender or sexual identities. This is by no means a comprehensive look at the topic, but I'd like to offer a look at some of the reasons why I think it does a disservice to our communities. Throughout pretty much the whole of time, this kind of obfuscation has obviously been a thing due to censorship, be it self-censorship or otherwise, but I'm kind of just hoping that at this point we'd be past it. Many excuses are often given for it, namely that using real labels for sexualities is anachronistic, too modern, or that it takes you out of the fantasy. Starting off with a mostly unrelated topic that kind of spurred me on to decide to finish this video quickly rather than working on something that I've got in the pipeline. The Star Wars wiki, Wookieepedia, is currently going through a lot of drama right now as the site has decided to leave it up to only active editors in a vote as to whether or not dead-naming trans creators and contributors to the franchise is best practice or not. The wiki is way out of line for doing this, and they 100% deserve as much pushback as possible. They're also doing a lot of other things that are really questionable, such as banning editors who interact with certain tweets that criticise them, as they view it as manipulating the vote. What this has started is a rise in people making recent edits in order to count as active editors. And it's drawn a lot of attention to the fact that in the wiki there is no category or classification for LGBT characters. As somebody who spent a few solid years of my teenage life obsessing over articles on that site and using it to learn a lot more about the universe and find characters that I identified with or were interested in, I've never been an editor, but have used it a lot to find a lot of related content that could have been curated so much better if they just got over this thinking that because characters aren't called LGBT in the universe, that categorizing them doesn't make sense. And despite all this, they actually do have a non-binary characters category, because these characters exist, and it doesn't make any sense for them to be put into binary categories that they already had. The term non-binary doesn't exist in the universe, but they don't extend that logic to the rest of the wiki and the rest of the characters in it. These characters exist, have existed, and will continue to exist for a long time. Unless they erase the canon again. But what I really want to draw attention to is the fact that, like Star Wars fandoms, in a lot of genre fiction, LGBT labels are seen as anachronistic when there is zero need for them to be. So, choosing a random word out of a hat that I definitely haven't picked beforehand, let's choose the word mausoleum. The root of this word is derived from the burial chamber of the Greek ruler Mausolus. Words like this are called eponymous. It means that they're named after someone in history. If you were to read a fantasy book that explicitly called a character a lesbian, I'm sure you'd run into people objecting to it because it would imply that the existence of the Greek island of Lesbos or of the poet Sappho. But thousands and thousands of words are eponymous in similar ways, and most of them aren't subjected to the same level of scrutiny as this. Even words whose roots aren't eponymous, we can extend this to pretty much every word, phrase, or idiom used in language. Your fantasy world doesn't have a Germanic history, but you might still call these weapons spears, from the Proto-Germanic speru, for instance. For most of these words, we can assume that either A, there is a parallel history where it makes sense as to why an eponymous word would still be called such, or B, it doesn't really matter, nobody cares. This is where we really get into the root of why this topic annoys me so much. It's a genre staple at this point to talk about sexuality in terms of she prefers the fairer sex, he prefers the company of men, that's just not my vibe, without ever attributing labels to them. In many ways, we assume that the societies that these people are in are past labels. When creators try to create their own versions of actual terms, it tends to come across as embarrassing, like in Ready Player One, when Ernest Cline muddled AMAB, which means assigned male at birth, into DMAB, designated male at birth, because it sounded more science fiction-y. On the part of many creators, it's a poor example of representation, erases terms that people really relate to, and in the case of a lot of fiction, still leads to fandom infighting, and erasure of character sexualities. This leads to this scenario where, for example, lesbian characters aren't called lesbians in Star Wars, so we're not going to include a category for them, is viewed as fine. The fiction standard of these labels are too real-worldy for this universe can seem pretty fair enough in universe, until it begins to actually impact the real world, where fandoms deny that these characters are who they are, or deem them unimportant to categorize for people who want to find more characters like them. They call them lovers, they describe them as fancying the company of men or women, they hint and poke at their identities being there, but actually acknowledging them is deemed too out there. In quite a few ways, I have less of an issue with terms being made up to represent the same thing in fantasy, but this does just water the issue down, cementing the fact that our identities are often seen as out of place in many ways, because they're too modern, may change in the future, and don't matter in the long run. This issue in writing circles tends to come up around the same time as arguments such as using they as a pronoun is too confusing, or that it doesn't matter because it's a modern issue, and of course my book is timeless. Calling representing LGBT people too Earth-like, while struggling as hard as they can to find the most roundabout way to call something what they essentially mean is a hovercar. We have iconic pieces of LGBT representative media where characters have concrete sexualities, but the words are never said. Series like Mass Effect have canonically romanceable lesbian, gay and bi characters, although arguably in the first two games this was only done through a heavily straight male point of view, and no gay male romance was available due to this, with lesbians being the often fetishized option simply by virtue of having the assets already made for the male protagonist and being reusable.
That the writers did not mark dialogue lines for genders. Voice actors of both male and female Shepard recorded all of Shepard's dialogue. Once the lines were recorded, there was a brief high-level discussion about whether we should make Kaidan and Ashley bisexual. Since the lines were already there, the leads decided not to do it. They created a lesbian alien option after all. It did occur to them to include a gay option. They simply decided against it.
But even in these games, and in other BioWare games for example, they use the excuse of explicitly referring to their sexualities would take up valuable word count, while in reality they actually use up far more of this limited word count in order to let straight male characters know homo a character they might accidentally seduce.
Level designer Dusty Everman, who wrote Steve, explained on the official BioWare blog, "When Cortez says, 'I lost my husband,' every player knows his sexuality, so precious word budgets aren't spent to establish that fact. If a male Shepard has gone through Steve's conversations, his romance can be locked in at the Citadel Club. First, Shepard can signal that Steve's attention is welcome. Then he has the very clear option to say whether he likes men or women. If Shepard chooses to dance with Steve, he can say,
'I want to be more than just friends, Steve.'
So precious word budget is spent on multiple checks to make absolutely sure everyone understands something homosexual is going on. Steve's romance dialogue adds up to only 2.5 minutes. One of them is spent checking if Shepard really wants to be gay. It's the same for Kaidan. When he asks Shepard to be with him, the female Shepard simply has to say yes. A male Shepard has to say yes and then reaffirm that he definitely did not misunderstand."
The video that I'm quoting is a really good video from a channel that sadly hasn't updated in a while, but I'm going to link it because I think it's really worth a watch. And side note, while writing this, I remembered that the only time I can actually think about encountering an explicit reference to the word lesbian in popular fantasy is this fucking line in The Witcher 2 that single-handedly turned me off of playing the game for years.
My favourite type of magic. Lesbomancy.
We have popular fiction where creators actively avoid using real labels for characters and dismiss criticisms of erasure from fans who heavily identify with those labels, while still perpetuating harmful tropes about us. The showrunner for the 100, I don't know, it is pretty infamous for refusing to call characters any labels in canon, including refusing to call the lesbian character Lexa a lesbian, saying that their society had progressed past the need for labels, while still killing her off in probably the most egregious bury a gays example in modern media. Many creators like him like to view the use of labels as outdated, and think it's a sign that their work is more progressive when they represent a society where labels aren't needed, rather than them being important cultural terms that many underrepresented minorities actually like to identify with. In many media depicting LGBT characters, we not only don't get any labels attributed to them, but we don't get any discussion of in-universe sexuality at all. In The Legend of Korra, people argued for the longest time over whether or not depicting these two female characters as a couple was earned. For many viewers who didn't read the sapphic subtext in the final series, these characters ending up together in the finale felt completely out of the blue. And that wouldn't have happened if Nickelodeon hadn't prevented any mention of identities or romantic feelings before this. Using one of my favourite pieces of fiction as an example, in interviews around The Last of Us, the non-lesbian creative team consistently refer to the lesbian main character as only queer.
And also for players, this is the first time we found out that Ellie is queer. I'm curious when you found that out and what it was like bringing that into the role.
Yeah, when we had finished the game, right before we had started the DLC, I think is when Neil told me, he's like, hey, I want to talk to you about this and your thoughts on this. I have an idea for the DLC, and something that I've thought is I think Ellie is queer. And what are your thoughts on that? And I'm pretty sure that's when it happened. I know for me, for a lot of the first part of the game, we hadn't talked about Ellie's sexuality. And I always felt like when that was decided, something clicked with Ellie, because she's definitely queer.
We have a poignant scene where Ellie and Dina see themselves represented in this LGBT bookshop, but they don't know how or why this is. They're just there trying to survive. They don't understand the cultural importance because the only media they've ever consumed was mostly salvaged by straight people in their mostly straight communities. They have no LGBT community, and it's specifically portrayed that way to highlight how damaging and sad that can be.
Look. It's us, right?
But in the same media, we know the word lesbian exists because the gay bookshop exists, and the main character is called a violent slur for lesbians.
Hey! This is a family event.
Sorry.
Remember next time there's kids around.
Yeah, like you're setting such a great example.
Oh, just what this town needs. Another loudmouth dyke.
The fuck did you just say?
We are given the representation of a sneering, hateful old man spitting slurs in our face, but not of a lesbian being able to proudly call herself a lesbian. The characters talk about their identities, but they skirt around the actual labels. For some characters this can make more sense than others, such as Lev, who is a child who doesn't know how to call himself a trans boy, because he grew up in an oppressive cult that imposed strict gender roles on him. But for others, like Ellie and Dina, who grew up in a community with more social links to our own, having them called slurs by their peers, but never acknowledged that they might know their own identities, comes off as whitewashing. We can't refuse to call a character a lesbian and then use queer as a catch-all term as if it wouldn't imply a similar slur to the one thrown at her at the time. Ellie knows to call someone a bigot for calling her a slur, but the game's rejection of calling her anything proudly paints its own anachronism, one where we just gloss over people's identities rather than taking the time to maybe look at the way that they impact characters, especially young characters growing up in an interesting environment. More of a personal note, but when I was a young teenager and exploring my identity, I'd only heard lesbian as an insult. That the adults around me hoped that I didn't grow up to be one, and that the girls at my school thought I was a disgusting one. When I realised that being a lesbian wasn't just a word people used to call me gross, but was a beautiful historic word with centuries of history behind it, I realised what I was and how people using it derogatorily at me didn't change that. At that age, I proudly wrote myself a long, loving note with the words, "I am a lesbian and that's okay," repeatedly, and that's how I came out to myself. Seeing a character that we've spent as much time with as we have Ellie through 2 long games, seeing media refuse to call lesbians such, reminds me of when I just thought it meant everybody hated me, and that lesbian was a dirty word that they would use to mock me. And it's sad that consuming media like this, my first thought is, I hope that Ellie doesn't grow up thinking the same thing, and she doesn't have an LGBT community to teach her any different. I've actually seen this refusal to call characters what they are end up being used for really regressive purposes. People invalidate the identity of Dina, a proud bisexual woman, because she is in a relationship with a woman. Or hateful transphobic comments calling Lev just a confused little girl, and using the lack of explicit language in the game as an excuse to defend their arguments. In the same vein, I see a lot of creators only referring to wholly individual communities with their own struggles as queer, when a blanket term doesn't necessarily cover the intricacies involved in a character's arc. I can't even count the amount of times I've seen the lesbian main character in Bly Manor mislabeled or erased because non-lesbians consistently fail to relate to her arc, and they misunderstand what compet is and label her as bi instead because she nearly married a man. So, the fun thing about trying to get assessed for ADHD is that it turns out a big problem I have right now is reading is essentially impossible. I can barely focus on words that I've written, let alone anybody else's. I've got a bunch of books on my list and it's really just not happening right now. So I want to thank the Sapphic Writers Community group on Facebook, where a helpful member gave me a sample list of a bunch of Sapphic fantasy novels that they'd read recently. A lot of these were marketed with the word lesbian in the description or blurb, but they didn't contain lesbian or similar anywhere in the text. Some of these books are titles that I've highly been looking forward to, and the absence of the word lesbian obviously isn't going to make me not read them, but it says a lot, and in many ways this extends outside of genre fiction. There's a lot of media with LGBT main characters made for mainstream consumption that just doesn't use their labels, as if the topic just never comes up. But it's never going to stop them from including a sex scene, is it? I guess what I'm trying to get across here is that it's a little depressing for the norm to be the obfuscation of our identities. Seeing characters call themselves what you are is important to a lot of people, especially for a lot of trans people who are demonized, and lesbians who get told that the word lesbian is gross, a dirty word reflective of a porn genre rather than of people, and especially bisexuals who just get called promiscuous. I'd love for this to take a back seat, and for writers to start writing characters that can proudly call themselves what we call them, anachronisms be damned. Seeing characters identify as themselves proudly is an important aspect of representation that I feel is really ignored by a lot of media in lieu of just having them be there. What I want to say to the admins and editors on Wookieepedia is this. In-universe terms, and things you view as convenience when directing traffic to your website, don't get to take rule over the lives of real people. Don't dead name anybody. And if you're in the position to be the arbiter of whether or not LGBT people are constantly reminded of how little we're considered in the community you create, sitting on the fence is the same as actively harming us. Thank you for watching. This video is shorter than my last one, although I actually thought it would end up being quite a bit shorter than it turned out to be. I kind of cobbled this together a little bit faster than originally planned because I'm trying to make my main focus for a little while to be a long and personal video on a certain genre of movies, which is going to be quite hard emotionally and to find the time to do. So I wanted to get this out of the way, especially as it became more relevant with the whole Star Wars thing happening. There's a lot more research I could have done into this, and I may actually still end up doing. I'm aware that there's similar comparisons to race that I could have gone into here, but as a white person I didn't feel equipped to cover that without proper consultation and consideration of other viewpoints, especially as this is more of just a brief overview of my opinions on a certain topic rather than covering complicated issues in depth. Please let me know what you thought of it anyway, and thank you so much for watching.